first after church for the game. So you don't have to come, but she wanted you to know.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
What's new? Pussycat? Who won? Who won? DJ. Are you gonna? You got a permit?
I got to do Sundays anyways.
Please go, right? I've been tasked to yell at you, so.
Testing 1, 2. Testing. All right. Okay, 1 minute, and we'll get started. Okay, let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask His blessing for this morning's study. To start. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for your word. Thank you for the freedom to come and serve and worship today in your presence, Lord. I just pray that hearts and minds are open to the things you are going to teach us through 1 Samuel chapter 14 and the many different actions and thoughts and behaviors of your people during this period of history. And so I just pray that once again we are able to take truths from these lessons and be able to apply them to our lives and be able to see the truths and learn much more about you through the pages of this book, Lord. And so I pray again, open up hearts and minds this morning to your word, and just pray it'll be a time of blessing as we fellowship together and go over your word. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we'll start today, as usual, do a little review, get your minds going, reminding you what we went over last week, get set. This week I was very aggressive, and I'm trying to get through 31 verses, believe it or not. So we're going to give it a try. I don't know how that's going to work, but you should have your notes. We'll do a little review. The other thing I'm going to do today is, because every once in a while I like to set the context, is I'm going to read a good portion of chapter 14. So I'll do a bit more reading just to give it just a total context again. Maybe as I read, I'll also add some comments, and then we'll get into the notes. All right, so we'll do a little review, and we'll do some reading, and then we'll get into the notes. So I do have notes in the back. The Battle of Michmash Pass and Saul's Rash vows, today's lesson. Do you have enough for everybody?
Yeah, but I don't have my microphone. It's probably, is it laying on the thing up there because Michelle was using it?
No, I twisted the microphone. You have to go in the back, get the batteries, put them in the microphones in the drawer. Okay, last week we studied the events that are going to lead up to this week's Battle of Michmash Pass between Israel and the Philistines. After Samuel left Gilgal disgusted, Saul numbered his men to see just how many troops he had left. He had 600. So he took his 600 men together with Jonathan and marched slightly southwest and settled base camp near the town of Geba, just a little over a mile south of the pass. Now he chose this spot for his command center because it had an easily identifiable landmark in the form of a local pomegranate tree. Now at around the same time, he summoned the acting high priest of Israel by the name of Ahijah. Now Ahijah was the great-grandson of Eli, and in the camp he was wearing a high priest's ritual vest called an ephod, or an ephod. Now we don't know anything else about Eli's priestly line as far as what they've been doing or where they've been actually serving since Eli passed, only that Eli's great-grandson now appears at Saul's side, and he is wearing the same ephod that his great-grandfather wore before him. Now, what could be keeping the king from attacking the Philistines? What's the delay here? What was his thinking? Now, possibly it was the numbers, since Saul commanded only 600 men against an innumerable amount of foot soldiers and 3,000 chariots. It would have been very intimidating. The army of the Philistines across the pass grossly outnumbered the Israelites. Perhaps it was the disadvantage the Israelites had against the Philistine weaponry. And this certainly would give anyone, at least on a human level, in such a high-stakes battle as this, it would give anyone a bit of a pause. Well, Jonathan was not going to sit idly by while the Philistines sent out raiding parties against his people and continued to stock up for an all-out offensive. He came up with a plan. Knowing that in holy war, where God was fighting with Israel against their enemies, numbers and weaponry didn't matter. So he figured that if he stepped forward in faith and depended on the Lord to give him a sign, the Lord just might fight for him and save the day. The plan was that he and his armor bearer would sneak off alone and approach the Philistine garrison that sat very close to dual crags that existed on both sides of the Michmash Pass. Now, he would alert the Philistine sentries of his presence, and the deal was this. If the Philistine soldiers said, "We will come down," then Jonathan and his man would stay in the pass, and if they came down, they'd fight right there. But if the Philistine soldiers said, "Come on up," this would be the Lord's signal to go up there and fight. Now, the confident Philistine soldiers who saw these two lone Hebrews coming toward them began to scoff as one wondered to the other what brought these two out of their hidey holes. So they said to Jonathan and his armor bearer, as young men will do, "Come on up. We want to tell you something." Now, this was all the signal Jonathan needed from the Lord. He moved to a steep part of the crag, which would have hid his approach, and he began to climb using his hands and feet. The sentries, no doubt believing that those two Hebrews must have turned back to their own camp, were caught off guard. In a narrow space equivalent to a patch of land plowed by a yoke of oxen in a day, Jonathan and his man initially dispatched 20 Philistine soldiers themselves. The area was narrow enough so that Jonathan would take on no more than one or two soldiers at a time, while his armor bearer would have mop-up duty for anyone still alive as Jonathan continued to move forward and move forward and move forward. This initial slaughter would have alerted the main camp of the Philistines. These two would need additional help. This is where God steps into human history once again, and what we're going to see and read in chapter 14 that ends up becoming the Battle of Michmash Pass. We're going to read, and we're going to start in verse 13. And again, usually I don't read a large section like this because I like to piece it, but I'm going to read it just for greater context. We're going to start just as Jonathan is going to go up and meet these Philistine sentries, and we're going to read through to verse 46. I might make some additional comments as we go through. All right, so we're going to be in 1 Samuel. Let me get some water before I read all these verses. 1 Samuel 14, we're going to start in verse 13, and I'm going to read all the way to verse 46. Verse 13. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet with his armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about a half a furrow and an acre of land. And there was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked so that it became a great trembling. Now Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away. This is the Philistine camp, started to melt away, and there's panic. And they went here or there. And Saul said to the people who were with him, "Number now, see who is gone from us." And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. Then Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God here." For the ark of God was at the time with the sons of Israel. Now it happened while Saul talked to the priest that the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. So that Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." And we'll talk about that in a little bit, what that means. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was a great confusion. Now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And when the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines had fled, even they also pursued them closely in the battle. So the Lord delivered Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Beth-aven. Now, verse 24, this rash vow. Now the men of Israel were hard-pressed that day, for Saul had put the the people under oath, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the people tasted food, and all the people of the land entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, there was a flow of honey, and no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard when his father put the people under the oath. Therefore he put out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the people answered and said, "Your father strictly put the people under oath, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food today.' And the people were weary." Then Jonathan said, "My father has troubled the land. See now how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of this honey? How much more if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found. For now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great." They struck among the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very weary. The people rushed greedily upon the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, saying, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating the blood." And he said, "You have acted treacherously. Roll a great stone to me today." And Saul said, "Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, each one of you bring me his ox or his sheep, and slaughter it here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the bloods." So all the people that night brought each one his ox with him and slaughtered it there. Saul built the altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he built to the Lord. Verse 36, "And Saul said, 'Let us go after the Philistines by night and take a spoil among them until morning light. And let us not leave a man of them.' And they said, 'Do whatever seems good to you.' So the priest said, 'Let us draw near to God here.' Saul inquired of God, 'Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel?' But he, the Lord, did not answer him on that day. And Saul said, 'Draw near here, all you chiefs of the people, and investigate and see how this sin has happened today. For as the Lord lives, who delivers Israel, though it is Jonathan my son, he shall surely die.' But none of all the people answered him. And then he said to all Israel, 'You shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side.' And all the people said to Saul, 'Do what seems good to you.' Therefore Saul said to the Lord, the God of Israel, 'Give a perfect lot.' And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Saul said, 'Cast lots between me and Jonathan my son.' And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, 'Tell me what you have done.' So Jonathan told him and said, 'Indeed, I tasted a little honey with the end of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am, I must die.' Now Saul said, 'May God do this to me, and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan.' But the people said to Saul, 'Must Jonathan die, who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day.' So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place." And I want to stop there. Let's go back to verse 15. Let's see how the Lord intervenes here. It's top of page 1 in the notes. And it says, "And there was a trembling in the camp in the field and among all the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked so that it became a great trembling." Verse 15. So once Jonathan and his armor bearer killed the initial 20 sentries at the pass, the main military command tent was most certainly alerted to the attack. If the Lord does not intervene here, we may have a completely different ending, with the reinforcements from Central Command eventually mowing down both Hebrews in short order. I mean, Jonathan and his armor bearer were in trouble. There's just two of them. So If the Lord doesn't intervene, Jonathan and his man would be dead and Saul's army would still be hanging around Geba. But the Lord did step into human history. Now notice that the Lord caused the earth to tremble, but this was no ordinary earthquake. Now, if it was, the earth would have surely trembled under Saul's feet, or would have been felt by many others in the tribal territory of Benjamin. And when we read this, we don't see that. We see a very localized earthquake. The trembling occurred was local, so local that only the earth under the Philistines' camp shook. Now, I will say this, that sometimes God uses natural phenomenon, earthquakes, tsunamis, and other things to accomplish his purposes, or even use it as a judgment. So this has occurred in the past. Now, we can't say in this instance that this was God using, let's say, the natural shifting of tectonic plates along fault lines. I mean, this wasn't this natural earthquake that might normally occur. But God has used earthquakes before. Regular earthquakes, tectonic plates shifting to bring about judgment. The language in here shows that God simply shook the ground under the feet of the Philistine army. And that was it. It was very local. Understanding that this is instead of a regular natural phenomenon, this is a specific shake where the Lord just shook the ground underneath the Philistines' feet. So then, rather than responding to Jonathan's attack and organizing themselves and dispatching of these two Hebrews, right, they were thrown into a panic. The shaking caused the camp to be thrown into a panic, thus protecting Jonathan and the armor bearer and, of course, accomplishing God's purposes. So God is shaking the ground underneath the Philistines. Now, this type of supernatural intervention was promised by God many years before. We've seen it in the past. In Exodus 23:27, the Lord makes this promise. I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion all the people among whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. You run and screaming in terror. They'll turn their backs to you. Deuteronomy 7:23 says, but the Lord your God will deliver them before you and will throw them into great confusion until they are destroyed. The idea here in these two sections is when God sanctioned a holy war, he promises to supernaturally intervene and aid the army of Israel by throwing confusion into the enemy camps. I mean, there are a number of examples even before this where the Lord wreaked such havoc among the enemies of Israel that by the time Israel's troop actually arrive on the battlefield to fight, those enemy soldiers are fleeing, or they're killing each other, or simply running for their lives. I mean, you just raising their hands in the air and just screaming at the top of their lungs, just you see them scattering. And so Israel ends up coming to fight, but the Lord has already taken care of the battlefield, making it easy for them. You can see, and we're not going to read this morning, but look at Joshua 10. Look at Judges 7. That's by the time Gideon gets to fight the Midianites. They're in total confusion and disarray. Judges 7. 1 Samuel 7, the battle that we saw earlier in that chapter at Mizpah, the Lord sent confusion into the Philistine camp at that time as well. So we see that. And we're also going to see this in the future. We're going to see this in the future battle of Armageddon. The same terror and confusion will occur. Zechariah the prophet says this, in that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with bewilderment and his rider with madness. But I will watch over the house of Judah while I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. So this is not going to be the last time it happens as well. In the future, there's going to be great confusion and a panic as the Lord returns the earth to defeat the armies of the earth that surround Jerusalem, that are camped in Armageddon, in the valley, right? In that valley up there, right? A Jezreel valley. And so the Lord is going to cause panic in that day as well when he comes to earth. So what I want to say is the Lord does work within the natural world. We have lots of people who are online who will tell you that the Lord sent an earthquake because something was elected in Congress and there was a decision made in the world. They may be true. In the end, we might be able to talk to the Lord, and he sent certain natural disasters as a judgment on the world. The reason why I don't get into that is because you could look at a lot of tsunamis, earthquakes, and other natural phenomena, and you can start saying, well, the Lord sent that, and trying to get into the mind of the Lord and pointing out and saying, well, that's because Congress made this decision. That's because they did this decision. I don't get involved in that, but you'll hear that. But it is certainly true, absolutely true, that the Lord uses natural disasters to discipline the world. And he intervenes. So, but here, he directly intervenes in a supernatural way. Not just using a natural earthquake, but supernaturally shaking the ground underneath the feet of the Philistines, is what my point is. The Battle of Michmash Pass. We're going to take a look at the next 8 verses. So what happens after the confusion strikes? It says, now Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude dissolved, and they went here or there. So Saul said to the people who were with him, look carefully now and see who has left us. And when they had looked, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here, for at the time the ark of God was with the sons of Israel. Now, while Saul talked to the priest, the commotion of the camp of the Philistines continued and increased. In other words, it got worse and worse as he's looking on. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand, and we'll talk about what that meant. And Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle. And behold, every man's sword was against his fellow Philistine, and there was a great confusion. Now the Hebrews who were with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around the camp, even they also returned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. And when all the men of Israel who kept themselves hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines had fled, they also closely pursued them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Beth-aven. So let's talk about these verses. It's normal for 2 armies who are situated on either side of a battlefield to have spies whose sole purpose is to watch the enemy camp closely, and then they would occasionally report back periodically to the general, in this case Saul. Saul's spies began to observe the trouble in the enemy camp that not only Jonathan and his armor bearer were causing, but in the aftermath of this earthquake, the terror and the confusion that caused the camp to literally, it says, dissolve. The idea is to melt away. They fled in many different directions. They're one clump, one camp, one group, and the next thing you know, the Philistines are scattering, running in all directions in panic. Now these men are observing this, so they, of course, did what they were supposed to do. They go back to report to Saul. Now it's interesting to note that Saul seems to perceive that it is somebody from his army that is causing the ruckus among the Philistines. A couple of times today, I'm going to act like I'm the director of the Saul movie. I'm going to make a movie, right? So I'm the director, so I got to decide what the actors do, right? They're standing here. This is their comments, just for fun this morning, as I see this occurring. So Saul is in his tent, and of course they come into Saul's tent. They would bust in and say, Saul, something's going on in the Philistine camp. There's disarray. They're running. So they're describing to Saul what's happening. So of course Saul gets up and he goes with it to a spot. I don't know if they had binoculars back then or something they could look through, but he goes to a spot where he can see the camp and he's observing for himself what's going on over there. And so they're panicking and they're melting away. So when he sees the ruckus for himself, I just have to wonder. I would have Saul looking off in the distance and then not saying anything to to the spies or to anybody to his command, he says one word out loud: Jonathan. That's how I would make this movie. He would be looking, and so I just wonder if his first response to the report was like one word: Jonathan. And he kind of knew in his heart, that it wasn't just anybody from his camp, but it was Jonathan, his own son. So he called the roll. That's what he does. It's what he calls for a roll. And when he did, it was determined that in fact Jonathan and his armor bearer were missing. So if he thought Jonathan, he's proven right. So he called the roll. Now, with his eyes on the Philistine camp, Saul tells Ahijah that it is time to bring the Ark of the Covenant forward to travel with them onto the battlefield. Now, if the Ark was indeed in Saul's camp, then he must have had Ahijah, and I want to talk about this. Ahijah's the only one mentioned here. He's the high priest, but no doubt that Ahijah had a contingent of other serving priests with him. We can't tell how many, a dozen, maybe more, maybe less, I don't know. But Ahijah's not alone. He's not the only priest here. He's just the only one mentioned because he's the most important character in this story. So it's apparent that Ahijah and his group of serving priests retrieved the ark from Kiriath Jearim specifically for this battle. In other words, Saul is not asking Ahijah to run to Kiriath Jearim now and bring back the ark to Geba. I mean, that's nonsensical. There's many, many miles to the south and west of the territory of Benjamin. Matter of fact, it's a border town on the border of the tribe of Benjamin and actually Dan's territory. So it would be a trek. So they must have already, when he called for Ahijah to meet him on the battlefield, bring your priests, bring the ark. See, the ark was already there, was already ready, available. So he's looking out, he sees what's going on, he calls for Ahijah. Ahijah comes up to his right, and he says, get the ark. It's one of his first commands. Ahijah, what does he do? Well, he wants to consult the Lord. So Ahijah, who has his hands inside the ephod in order to consult the Lord, remember we talked about there's two stones in the ephod, the Urim and Thummim stones. So these stones are in his vest. Of course, Ahijah is reaching inside his vest he's going to consult the Lord, whether to not only to go to battle now, but to bring the ark into battle. But Saul has seen enough. And so within a couple of minutes, and so if I'm setting this, he has Ahijah bring the ark, he's looking and he's observing, and he realizes that there's a great confusion. He sees his opening. So without looking at Ahijah, again, I'm just the director, he puts his hand out and says, and that's the withdraw your hand. In other words, Saul's saying, we don't have time right now to consult the Lord. We got to go. We got to go now. Withdraw your hand. In other words, Ahijah was automatically going to consult the Lord before he would bring the ark into battle. And when Saul told Ahijah to withdraw your hand, he was basically saying that there is no time to consult the Lord. We got no time to waste. We better get ready. And he had determined in just a few minutes that the time to act was now. And of course, we might agree, we strike while the iron's hot. Go, Saul, go. What are you waiting for? Obviously, the Lord is doing a work. And we're going to talk a little bit about this, but withdraw your hand. So no time to consult the Lord. But remember, Saul had plenty of time to consult the Lord earlier, yet he delayed because of this very uncertain situation. It's funny, now that Saul could taste victory, it was too time-consuming to stop and get the Lord's blessing. Now, I admit that this type of failure myself on days when I have so much to do, and I allow those tasks to derail my time spent with the Lord in the morning. If my morning devotions are disrupted because of whatever activity on those days that I begin doing, I seem to never go back to devotions, or at least I cut the devotions off short. And I don't know if anybody else has that problem too. If I wake up on a Saturday and I don't commit to spending time with the Lord in Scripture and devotions and prayer, but I start. Maybe it's answering a phone call that I probably should have just called that person back. Once I start on the daily task, boy, I start to go. It's a character flaw that I have with this. And I go, right? And then once the day starts, I'm too busy to consult the Lord. I'm too busy, and I find I do that occasionally. Here Saul had plenty of time to consult the Lord, but now he had determined that he's too busy, that he needed to get everyone ready for battle. And it's a problem here. Once Saul decided to go, it was inconvenient to stop and consult the Lord. And that was his decision. And maybe he even determined that this disruption in the Philistine camp must be the hand of the Lord, so there was simply no need to stop and get his blessing. This must be the Lord, so we're going to go. Saul had another problem. We talked about this before. Saul had a hard time acting unless he was guaranteed victory, and would occur basically no cost to himself. And we found that Saul was ready and willing to act when he felt there was no cost. There was not a lot of risk. And right now, the risk factor went down, right? We have the Philistine camp in disarray, and now all of a sudden, he's too busy to consult the Lord. He's going to run headlong into battle because the Philistines, most of them are fleeing. And so we see this attitude of Saul coming out in this situation. Well, Saul quickly rallied the troops and marched double time across the Michmash Pass to take advantage of the chaotic situation. We're never told whether he grabbed the ark or brought the ark. He just went. But what they observed was anything but sensible. So again, I'm the movie director. Here comes Saul up over the pass. He's taking a look. He stops to take a look, and him and his men are looking at the scene here, and it's crazy. The Philistines were killing each other. One Philistine soldier against another. There was so much panic and confusion, it was doubtful they even knew what they were doing. Secondly, a large group of fellow Hebrews who had seemingly made peace with the Philistines and were basically visitors among them began to turn on their masters and attack. Now, I put in parentheses here, this may be why the Philistine lords will not let David fight with them. If we look a little bit into the future, David is going to fight with the Philistines, and he's with the king of Gath, right? And he wants to fight. And the Philistine lords say, whoa. No. We don't want him and his men. Why? Why were they so afraid to let David into the battle? Because so they would, all right, if they get into the battle, we're in the heat of the battle, and David and his men will turn against us and fight for his fellow countrymen. So isn't it funny that this happened here in this passage, and possibly was the reason why the Lord said, wait a second, we know how this goes, all right? So we don't know anything about these Hebrews, but they are in the camp. Apparently they have some sort of peace. We're not told that how they're dealt with afterwards, or they're called traitors. It's just there's these Hebrews, they're in the camp, and they turn on and start attacking the Philistines. So you have these Hebrews attacking the Philistines, you have Philistines killing Philistines, you have others running like for their lives. Jonathan and his armor bearer were in this mix somewhere. They're still mixing it up. Then as the Philistine soldiers began to disperse, the author tells us, many of these local deserters, the ones that were hiding in caves, well, they heard, and they start to join the pursuit of the Philistines. See, the Philistines are having a really bad day. They have a really bad day. Now, before this section ends, the author makes sure to put this triumph in perspective. This was not Saul's victory. This was not Jonathan's victory. He says, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle spread beyond Beth Aven. Now, Beth Aven, if you will look at a little bit at the map, we do have another map in our notes, but that is west. Of course, after the initial panic, what would the Philistine soldiers do? Okay, think about our map, and I'll use my hands. Okay, Michmash Pass. If we go towards the Mediterranean Sea, that's where Philistine territory is, west and south. So after the initial fleeing and running, they're smart guys, they would have turned west. So all that army, wherever they had fled, whatever direction they got out of town, they would have ended up west and south, trying to get back to their own territory. So when the pursuit occurred, the pursuit didn't occur towards the Jordan River. There's no reason for that. The pursuit would have occurred west and south. And so the pursuit was on, and it was a foot race. The Philistine soldiers trying to get back, they're not going to fight a battle. And of course, the Hebrew soldiers, the Israelite soldiers, trying to catch up with them and trying to get as many as they can. And this is what's going on. So the battle spread west over towards the edge of a Benjamite territory. Saul's foolish vow. Now, anybody have any questions over or comments over the battle? Saul's foolish vow, and if you've studied this, you've studied what went on here, you've studied this vow a little bit. We're going to talk about it. Verses 24 to 31. Now the men of Israel were hard-pressed on that day, for Saul had put the people under an oath, saying, and here's the vow, cursed be the man who eats food before evening, and until I've avenged myself on my enemies. Listen to that statement. So none of the people tasted food, and all the people of the land entered the forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, there was a flow of honey. But no man put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard when his father put the people under an oath. Therefore, he put out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it in a honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the people said, your father strictly put the people under the oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food today. And the people were weary. And Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. See now, how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of his honey. How much more if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found. For now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great. And they struck among the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon. And the people were very weary. So earlier we talked about how Saul rallied his troops. Now he wanted them ready and properly motivated to fight so many Philistines. And we might think that he gave an inspiring and heartfelt speech about defending the nation and for God and country. And of course, he may have done that. That's what leaders do. All right, we're going to go now, we're going. And we've got to go quickly. The camp of the Philistines is in confusion. Every man grab your courage. We're outnumbered, but we have them on the run. He might have even invoked the Lord's name. But it seems that before the men began the journey towards Michmash Pass, that the author is telling us here that Saul made the people swear this oath. Cursed be the man who eats food before evening until I've avenged myself on my enemies. This means that he is commanding his men with an oath to go without eating for the entirety of this battle. When evening comes, two things happen, because there is a cap on when this oath ends. Two things happen at evening. The fighting stops because of the approaching darkness. Okay, so both the Philistines and the Israelites will end fighting in the evening. It gets too dark, right? And so, of course, there's going to be no more fighting. This battle will go all the way until the sun goes down. And that's why before it was asked by a prayer from, who was that? Joshua, right? That the sun continue to shine so they can continue to fight. So, but darkness comes, the day is done, the fighting day is done. Each Hebrew day begins at twilight. So we have the end of the fighting, but we also have the end of the day. So at twilight, when the first stars come out, a new Hebrew day occurs. It's a new calendar day. So this oath, or this vow, is in effect for the rest of that day, for the rest of that calendar day. And so that's the idea there. Now, in the past, we have talked about the nature of vows, especially during this time period, but I want you to keep some things in mind. The ancient Israelites, along with many of the other people groups, took vows deadly serious. Deadly serious. They would go out of their way to avoid breaking them at all costs. Now, for the pagans, it would anger the gods, and nobody wanted the anger of the gods on them. Now, in the minds of these people, breaking a vow would sometimes cause irreversible curses on a nation or an individual. So cursings would come upon people. And so they took them seriously. Many individuals, funny, in this time period, even amongst the Israelites, right? We'll see that they lie, cheat, and steal from their own family members. They would lie and cheat and steal their own mother. Sell her short, whatever, they don't care. They have no scruples. But the same people that do that, you wouldn't catch them breaking a vow. It's amazing. You wouldn't catch them breaking a vow. So they would lie, cheat, and steal from their own families, but they won't break a vow. Now, did our Lord have these incidents in mind when he warned them against making vows? Was he thinking about and alluding to men like Jephthah we saw in the book of Judges, chapter 11, Jephthah and his unauthorized vow? We see King Saul with his vow as well. Remember what our Lord said, Matthew 5:33-7. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but you shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say this to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king, nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your statement be, yes, yes, or no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. And so you wonder, our Lord, looking back at these instances where the Israelites and the people of this time period made vows, and they didn't turn out well most of the time. And today's vow in this chapter is a bad vow that causes much trouble. It should have been yes, yes, or no, no. Now, first of all, let's talk about how bad this vow is. Everyone knows, even people who have no military intelligence or experience, that an army moves what? On its stomach. An army moves on its stomach. A well-fed army is an army that is healthy and ready to fight a long battle. Generals make sure the troops under their command are well-fed if they want the best results. It is nonsensical and goes against all logic to ask men to fight for a half a day or longer with no food to replenish vital calorie needs and energy loss. And in a long battle like this, stamina was as important as ability. Both sides eventually were exhausted, thirsty, and hungry to the point of collapse. Blood sugar levels were critically low. Dehydration set in, and it wasn't unusual, even under the best of circumstances, to have warriors faint and be killed while they lay on the ground, not injured, but merely unconscious. Because of the nature of vows, none of Saul's soldiers would dare eat any food, despite this order being the most moronic order ever given. This was moronic and unnecessary. There was a great source of energy found in the local forest in the form of wild honey. Snacks like this can be critical in a long, drawn-out offensive. We actually used chocolate in much the same way for our soldiers in World War II, to have chocolate in their packs at all times in case their blood sugar went low and they needed some quick energy. But sadly, they weren't able to eat it and be refreshed. And we talked about the nature of vows. They wouldn't have broken this vow. None of them wouldn't dare. Now, secondly, the vow was not about God. It had nothing to do with about serving God, but selfishly about Saul. No one would eat, and then he adds this, and the author adds this for us, I have avenged myself on my enemies. That was the important thing. This wasn't about holy war or the protection of the people. It wasn't about Saul's sworn duty before God as the king. It was about how the Philistines harmed him personally, and it would be his revenge that would be exacted this day. Saul had already adopted the attitude of a despot. His men were cannon fodder. Their hunger and sacrifice were a means to his ends. All battles now were about his personal pride and status among the nations. Or, this was suggested too, did he even think that he would gain favor with God for such a pious act of sacrifice? How many people commit pious acts of self-denial, and they say it's an account of getting right before God, cutting themselves, fasting for, weeks. Think of monks. It's human nature to want to try to do something dramatic in order to please God, right? And so these men who are a lot of people who have this sense of working their way towards God and towards heaven, they tend to do great acts, seemingly pious acts of self-denial or self-harm. So, it could be in the mind of Saul that, this is pious. We're going to go into this battle and we're not going to eat. And we're going to do this for the Lord. Either way, it was, whatever this case would be, it was faulty thinking. It was totally senseless and unnecessary. And it was all about Saul. Lastly, his rash vow put his own son's life in jeopardy. Verse 27 says that Jonathan hadn't heard about the oath. He did what any soldier would do. He refreshed himself by eating some of the wild honey found in the area. He had been fighting the garrison and was in the middle of the Philistine encampment when Saul ratified the vow. He wasn't around. But one of the men told Jonathan what his father made the men swear. Jonathan understands how foolish his father had been when he stated this. Then Jonathan said, "My father has troubled the land. See now how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little of this honey. How much more if only the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of the enemies which they found. For now the slaughter among the Philistines has not been great." And that says they struck among the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon. Now, if we look at our map, we have our map at the top of page 5. This is a map we used before. Can everybody find Michmash in the very center of that map? And if you look at the arrows to the left, you'll see the blue arrows going west. So it is apparent that the bulk of the Philistine men fled west. That's the idea. Can everybody find to the left edge of the map Ajalon? Okay, so that's Ajalon. That is the border of Israelite territory. It seems to the west and south of that is Philistine, at least conquered territory. It's actually the tribal territory of Dan, but we don't know how many Danites were still left there. And so this is how far they chased him, the author is telling us. Chased them west, because that's where they're headed, west and south, out of town. And so we get a little idea of how far that was. And for men who hadn't eaten, they went pretty far. That's a good amount of miles that they did end up chasing for King Saul and for country. Now, Jonathan and the author are letting us know that Israelites only pursued the Philistines to the edge of their territory, right? Because they were hungry and thirsty and exhausted. The Israelite soldiers were no longer, at that point, capable of pursuing the Philistines. Just physically couldn't do it. Jonathan was disgusted at this oath Saul had made the troops swear to, as he commented that if the Israelite soldiers were allowed to eat, they may have even entered Philistine territory and had a greater victory and a greater spoil. So that's the deal with this vow and how this vow handcuffed and was a detriment to this battle. A famished army sins. In case you were wondering, what in the world happens in verses 32 to 35? What is all this about? This is what it says. The people rushed greedily upon the spoil. These are the things taken from the Philistines, and took sheep and oxen and calves and slew them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. And then they told Saul, saying, "Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood." And he said, "You have acted treacherously. Roll a great stone to me today. And Saul said, disperse yourselves to his commanders among the people and say to them, each of you bring me his ox and his sheep, slaughter it here and eat by the great stone. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So all the people that night brought each one of his ox with him and slaughtered it there. So Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was his first altar that he built to the Lord. Now Saul's army was weak from lack of food. And because of this condition, many of them sinned, it says in this passage. But it was not one that you may think. First, why are they allowed to eat at this point in time? How are they not breaking the oath? Till the evening. So we got to understand that the first stars are in the sky. The evening has occurred. It's twilight. The battle is done. The Philistines are wherever they are, and they've stopped. So it is evening. So the oath is over. They are allowed to eat. But what happens now that they're allowed to? Oh, I do want to talk about this. A new Hebrew day begins at twilight. We know that. But does anybody know why in the Hebrew calendar twilight is the beginning of a new calendar day? Genesis, creation. It says in Genesis 1:5, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So they take creation, the creation account, and they say the evening and the morning was the first. The evening occurs first, and so they have been, that's how their calendar runs. So at evening time, at twilight, if you were on the edge of the Sabbath begins at that point in time. Helps with context. So the oath was over. It was evening. The battle was over. It was a new day on the Hebrew calendar. Now, secondly, it sounds like they were simply slaughtering these Philistine animals and eating them raw. And I don't know if you thought that when you first read that on first notice. Like they were slaughtering them on the ground and they were eating the meat raw. And this is certainly not the case. They were not eating these animals raw. They were cooking them. The problem was in food preparation. The sin is that they are eating the animal without letting the blood, according to the standards of the Mosaic law, not according to the heathen standards, even not according to our standards right now. Have you ever cooked a burger on the grill where the blood kind of drains down? We get that raw meat. Okay, so according to the standards of the law, the blood has to completely drain from the meat. So they weren't doing that. All the animals were cooked on an altar or a raised stone for blood drainage purposes, so the blood could drain down and the meat was separated from the blood. They were cooking the animal meat on the ground with the blood among the meat. That was the problem. In another shining moment, and I say that with a caveat, the shining moment, surrounded by a bunch of mishaps and missteps, Saul actually does right here. He had a very large stone rolled before him, so his troops could properly prepare these animals for consumption. Now, I will say that conversely, and we'll keep this in mind, it was his fault to begin with. It was the rash vow that he put his soldiers on, that they were so starving that they're just cooking the animal improperly. So he has to hold the blame. Now, I want to talk about a fast fact about blood and how important it was for them to get the blood off the meat. Starting mostly in the Second Temple period, salt was used to help the Israelites clean the blood from the animal meat. See, salt itself is a really good absorbent, and it can handle basically absorbing large amounts of blood. So this practice, which probably occurred beforehand, but really during the Second Temple period, this practice of putting the salt and rubbing it and trying to clean the animal with the salt, well, this created substantial amounts of contaminated salt, or what we might call waste salt, that was eventually put to good public use. Blood-contaminated salts acted much like weed killer. Spread this salt over roadways and pathways, and it keeps the weeds and other vegetation from overgrowth. Jesus used this idea and practice when he said this. And it puts better perspective of Matthew 5. Listen, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? Waste salt, it is no longer good for anything. For what? Except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men, which is exactly what the waste salt was doing. They spread it all over the roadways, and men trampled on it. This is this waste salt here. So just a little bit of background information there of how salt was used and how important it was to get that blood drained off the animal meat and what was going on here. And so the Lord is making reference to the practice by his day of using this waste salt for the roadways, keep the roadways free, especially those cobblestones and the pathways we walked on, right? When we walked in center city, Jerusalem. Saul's foolish vow nearly kills Jonathan. I just want to finish up here. We've got a couple minutes. Then Saul said, let us go down after the Philistines by night. This is the night raid. And take a spoil among them until morning light. And let us not leave a man of them. And they said, do whatever seems good to you. So the priest said, let us draw near to God here. And Saul inquired of God. This is using the Urim and Thummim. Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he, the Lord, did not answer him on that day. And Saul said, draw near here, all you chiefs of the people, and investigate and see how this sin had happened today. For as the Lord lives who delivers Israel, though it is my son Jonathan, very fitting, he shall surely die. But none of the people answered him. Then he said to all Israel, you shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. Therefore Saul said to the Lord, the God of Israel, give a perfect lot. And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. And Saul said, cast lots between me and Jonathan my son. And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. So Jonathan told him and said, indeed, I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff that was in my hand. Here I am, I must die. And Saul said, may God do this to me and more also, for you shall surely die, Jonathan. But the people said to Saul, must Jonathan die, who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, not one hair on his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. Now, once his army was fed, Saul had another bright idea. He wanted to do a night raid, killing any remaining Philistine soldiers found on the roadways and taking one final spoil. Of course, they would be camped out. They would not be moving until morning light, and so he's going to catch them unawares. Saul's leaders agreed to the idea. They responded, do whatever seems good to you. Now, Ahijah suggests that they inquire of the Lord to get his take on the idea. Let's see what the Lord says. Now, it's funny, not ha-ha funny, but sadly funny. But where was this attitude before? Now they're going to inquire of the Lord. Now we're going to seek what the Lord wants in this situation. They're going to use the Urim and Thummim stones that are stored in the ritual vest of Ahijah. Now, in case it's been a while since we've gone over what these stones are, and here's just some further background for you to look. But the Urim means lights, and the Thummim means perfections. So the stones together means lights and perfections. They were two gemstones carried by the high priest in his ephod and were used to determine God's will. Now, no one is sure how they actually worked because the Bible doesn't give us enough information. They were thought to be, one was black and the other was white. Some think they lit up. We have the lights and perfections. So the Lord would answer by lighting up one stone and not the other. So there's a possibility that's true. But just to give you further information, they are first mentioned in the description of the breastplate of judgment. You can see that in Exodus 28 and Leviticus 8. When Joshua succeeded Moses as leader over Israel, he was to receive answers from God by means of the Urim through Eleazar the high priest. That's in Numbers 27. You can look at that. The Urim and Thummim are the next mention in Moses' dying blessing upon Levi, and we see that in Deuteronomy. And the following scriptures also speak of the Urim and Thummim: Joshua 7, 1 Samuel 14, we have it here, and 2 Samuel 21, just to give you a little bit of background information. But a strange thing happened, didn't it? The Lord is silent. The Lord does not answer. Saul has determined that somebody has committed a great sin against the Lord, and this is the reason for his silence. It's obvious. He invokes another rash oath that whoever is found guilty of this crime, even if it is his own son Jonathan, that person will be put to death. Whoever's guilty here. Of course, he excludes himself. You notice. He wasn't included. Saul then calls, because the Lord is silent with the Urim and Thummim, so he's going to call for lots, another way of determining God's will. He actually asked the Lord to cast a perfect lot. Now, they determine fault, and we have the people on one side, and you have Jonathan and Saul staying on the other side, and a lot was cast, and the lot chose Jonathan and Saul. The people were exonerated. The lot was cast between the two of them, and Jonathan was taken. And Saul then asked his son, "Tell me what you have done." And Jonathan confesses that he, in fact, was guilty of eating wild honey during the battle. Now, the Hebrew seems to indicate that Jonathan was not saying, "Here I am, I must die," although that could certainly be the case. But a better translation is that Jonathan actually asked more of a rhetorical question: "I must die?" In other words, another instance where Jonathan cannot even understand what his father is thinking here. And Saul seemed ready and willing to execute his son Jonathan, but the people stepped in. It says, "But the people said to Saul, 'Must Jonathan die, who brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, not one hair on his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day.'" All of these military and tribal leaders recognize that it was God who delivered them today. God's vessel for defeating the Philistines was not their king Saul, notice, but rather Jonathan himself that the Lord used. The pleading of the people won out because Jonathan was spared that day. Saul did not go on his night raid, and this marked the end of the Battle of Michmash Pass. It was it, right? Kind of anticlimactic. What is going on here? The end of the story of the Battle of Michmash was sort of anticlimactic, and the theme seems to be that it was this faulty king with his faulty thinking that put a cap on what could have been an amazing battle with an amazing result. They defeated the Philistines, but it could have been more thorough and long-lasting. The troops had success on the battlefield, but some may have even died because they were fighting in a state of exhaustion and hunger. This victory could have started a revival and a time of blessing and sacrifice, but the people were sinning and were put under a heavy and unnecessary oath. Finally, Saul's rash behavior on the eve of the battle, and as the eve of the battle ends in the pleading for Jonathan's life, and leaves us with this: "Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place." And what do I see in that last statement? Well, what should have been a celebratory day was marred by Saul's own decision-making. Now stay tuned for chapter 15 as we see that things only get worse for the leadership of Saul. So read ahead, and sorry, I didn't get a chance to questions today because we did run a little bit long, and I apologize for that. If anybody has any questions and they want to, or any comments, and they want to redirect, I can even add that into an introduction next week. So if you have any other comments, please don't hesitate to ask me. But again, sorry we didn't get a chance of question and answering today. I knew I bit off more than I can chew. It was a lot of material. So yeah. Hopefully it was a blessing to you guys. Dear Heavenly Father, just thank you for your word. Thank you for the faithful who come out every morning in adult Sunday school and listen to your word and listen to me speak about 1 Samuel and these incredible circumstances with the first king of Israel and how you interact with your people. And again, the hope is that we're encouraged as we sift through the detail, we can also see applications for our life. And I hope that is the case, that we can certainly apply these things, and we certainly see much more about your character and how you interact with these ancient Israelites. And that provides encouragement for us and understanding. And so thank you for your word, and just thank you for everyone that came out today. Bless today Pastor John as he brings the study to us this morning from the book of Acts, and give him strength and wisdom as he speaks today. And I pray all this in thanks. In Jesus' name, amen. Michelle? Have died. And I agree with you. He would have made how'd you
Check. Check, check, check. Check, check, check.